Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. This is the place where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. If you like what you hear, head to tvherstory.com and listen into all of our archives that are categorized to make it easier to find what you're looking for. And also while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter. Promise I'll never sell your information. Now on with the show. Advanced TV Historians, we have a special guest with us today, Julie Cohen, and I will be the first to say I am a fangirl and have met her for exactly, 30 seconds, shook her hand. Hi, I'm Cynthia from Minnesota, no less, because that's pretty much how I introduce myself when I'm not talking to you, listeners. Julie is an acclaimed storyteller. Her path to power as a documentarian is actually quite incredible, and it is power, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The stunning films that she has brought to us, biographical documentaries, as well as films that tell a probing story of real life pain and real life wins, I guess, or hope. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about that work, and then we're going to dig into the work that connects most closely to Advanced TV Herstory, and that is Julia Child, because wow, what an expansive career she had. Really important, and Julie did a great job of profiling that. I got to know Julie by following her on Twitter, where I used to be, and X, where I then left, and now find her on Instagram and Blue Sky, and you should too. Filmmaker Julie, because there are a few Julie Cohens in the business.
There are lots of us. And actually, one of my big social media things is that I always, one of the first things I do when I get a new platform is follow all the other Julie Cohens. I know most of them now, so follow them too, but mostly follow me.
Yes. And the most exciting part really became when I became the fangirl was watching the Julia movie, watching RBG get critical acclaim. And you went to the Oscars, and we're going to talk briefly about that as well. So, Julie Cohen, who are you and what is your path to your current position as documentarian that brings you to this power, this ability to share stories?
Yeah, I'm not feeling that powerful. But I do think there's a deep connection that's possible, and you can really change the way people are thinking with a good documentary. And I guess that is a kind of power, but in the, I don't know, power, I'm definitely feeling out of power right now. Let's put it that way, as I think a lot of the right thinking people are. Yeah, my path was relatively straightforward. I got into documentary film in the way that a lot of people, not most, but a sort of significant minority of us do, which is through the world of news and traditional journalism. I got a graduate degree in journalism, and I worked for most of my career as a more straightforward journalist in print, radio, and television journalism, ending up for the last 9 years of my news career at Dateline NBC, where I was a producer, writing and producing long form hour and 2 hour long, essentially documentaries, except with a fairly limited subject matter scope. We did occasional long form explorations of breaking news stories like September 11th and Hurricane Katrina, both of which happened while I was on the staff there, and spent actually a fair amount of time producing stories about. But for the most part, true crime was our thing. I do have a little bit of a legal background. I worked for a newspaper called Legal Times. I worked for Court TV, and I even got a master's in law for people that were journalists covering legal issues that wanted to understand the law a little better. So I enjoy and am interested in the law. But I worked at Dateline for quite a while. I really enjoyed it, although I kind of grew to enjoy it less as time went on, because the dark subject matter was, I found, like a weight. And as I grew, as I moved on in life, as I got into my 40s, I just felt like I wanted to go into something a little bit different. I wanted to take the skills that I had gathered and that my amazing bosses and colleagues at NBC had helped me develop, and put them towards kind of maybe telling this kind of stories that I wanted to tell, not necessarily the kind of stories that were going to be able to get 10 or 12 million primetime viewers to turn to your show and make you the number one in the time slot, which of course is the goal when you're working for network news. The people who preside over Dateline were and still are very smart. They've tried to, there's all kinds of different subject matter that the show has worked on in its now, I think, like 33 years of existence. Truthfully, they found that what the viewers gravitate towards is true crime. And I actually watched true crime as a viewer, but I kind of had moved past it as a creator because just frankly, like as I grew into middle age, like I didn't want to be in those dark places so much.
It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah, so for the most part, not entirely, but my films I've definitely gravitated towards positive, upbeat, inspirational, romantic, and funny stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we can linger on that whole Dateline NBC experience just for a minute, because a 33 a series with that longevity has covered so. I mean that is our visual archive. That in-depth approach. Are there any memories of producing any of those segments that you worked on that just really resonate with you, even if it is that moment of darkness that sometimes then propels people to lean toward the sun, to go where there's light?
Yeah, well, I guess since you're phrasing, I mean, there are many memorable moments, and some of my closest friends are there, so that's a lot of the memories revolve around those shared in the trenches experience. But when you focus on the thing that made me wanna move into another realm, it was actually producing a very quick turnaround hour following the very sad death of Anna Nicole Smith, someone who had really struggled a lot in life and was probably too easily dismissed and trivialized in the way that women also are. I mean, was she potentially, I mean, certainly she was a beautiful woman. Was she potentially more than that? Was she, from all accounts, she was a very kind person who cared deeply about her kids, and it was the suicide of her elder son that kind of prompted her to really fall apart. But because of the way that broadcast news works, we had to do that. I think I had to produce the hour on that in like 3 days, and that involved staying up all night and in an edit room, and I did a little bit of a feeling like, something that I had done not long before that, maybe like a year and a half before with Hurricane Katrina, when there were a lot of all nights too. But that felt a lot different. It felt like, wow, we're really doing something very important that the country needs. A key function of journalism is to let people know what's really happening in this tragic situation in New Orleans. Obviously, resonating today with the LA wildfires, like just a similar horrific situation that we need to look at. Why did this happen? How could we handle it better? What's the human cost? What's the cost to our country and our infrastructure? What are the racial disparities that are that are at play, and who's getting harmed the worst? All of the important things. So staying up all night on that didn't make me question my existence, but honestly, staying up a few nights staying up a few nights, telling the roller coaster and story of Anna Nicole Smith, a story that herself and her children like may or may not have actually wanted to be told, for huge public consumption. So I didn't mind getting assigned to it, but I also felt like I actually want to do something different. And in its heart, although I think people viewed her as entertainment, at its heart, that was an incredibly dark, sad story. And I just was like, I really would love to go out in search of some happier stories.
It was such a turning point of sort of supermarket tabloid journalism that was seeping into TV. There wasn't a whole lot else going on, and she was an easy mark for sort of zeitgeist misogyny.
Exactly. I mean, I would say, just having been in a mainstream journalistic world for a long time, I feel like I was, worked on some things that were very misogyny adjacent. And I am a feminist, so if I maybe wasn't thinking so clearly about it then, but in retrospect, that also felt like part of what I didn't really want to be a part of. just to be totally honest, like understanding that I was in a position where I could financially afford to take the financial risk that was leaving a good solid job with benefits and a 401k and all of the stuff that keeps people doing those kind of things, and health insurance, and really worthy. My husband, who also is a working journalist for many years, actually works for New York University now. He had a regular salary and he had health insurance that would cover both of us. So that allowed we happened to not have kids. It was a decision I made, which I think was a great decision for me. I don't think I'd recommend it to everyone because there's a degree of security and the privilege that allows that security that let me make that decision. And I'm very glad I made it, but I understand that I'm very lucky that I had the opportunity to make that choice too.
The notion that particularly we as white women, if you need to recognize your privilege, and that's an important step forward to sort of where understanding where we all are in the world. We are of like mind on this. The documentary of Julia Child probably was done once upon a time by the Lifetime Channel's series Intimate Portraits, which is sort of that's just my little go-to these days because I remain fascinated by its influence on me. You could be flipping around and there is Intimate Portrait of Julia Child or Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly and Princess Diana are the only two that you can find on like eBay. And I'm sure somebody just curbed them off of, their VHS. Do you remember watching any of those? Did that influence you at all?
No, you know what? I'm very familiar with intimate portraits. And in fact, often in written pitches and treatments for things, people will call something like where they're doing a biographical doc, they'll say it's an intimate portrait. And it's like, oh, no, we can't say that because to me, it has the association of that series. However, I'm not sure I ever saw it. I saw a lot of A&E biographies.
And it was the focus on women, and it was the first time really TV had dedicated that, and cable definitely changed the landscape for what people understood. But there are women then of the, late baby boom, Gen X variety that's how they came to know women, and it's not available. And it's become my little passion of how to bring this forward, even if it's not great, but it was still, 48 minutes of understanding what a woman's experience was. And for the most part, they were well produced. And the prolific producer among them is Lee Grant, who is still alive, who I would love to talk to.
Lee Grant, the actress?
Lee Grant, the director and producer and actress.
Okay.
And blacklisted. Yeah.
Okay. Like the Lee Grant that I know of. Interesting.
Yes, the Lee Grant. So you've instead taken the major American figures of Pauli Murray, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Julia Child, and you've brought them to the screen.
Yeah. So I should say, because for those for those three docs in particular are all docs that I made, directed, and produced with a partner, Betsy West. So it was kind of a decision that we made together. There wasn't a huge necessarily agenda. It really started with RBG and went from there. Betsy had executive produced and I had been a producer on a big series called Makers. You say you like stories about women. There was like a PBS AOL series called Makers that existed for many years, still exists in a slightly different form. Kind of reassessing and like amplifying the modern women's movement with women who were still alive, but in many cases getting on in years. So it seemed like an important time to record their stories. So that had sort of gotten the idea in our minds of women's stories being undertold. But it was through that project that Betsy had interviewed Justice Ginsburg for that, which meant she was sort of like a small piece in a larger documentary. And then there was a little 4-minute online profile about her. And I had actually separately interviewed Justice Ginsburg for a film that I made about a Lower East Side smoked fish store called Russ and Daughters, which RBG was a big fan of. So those interviews had taken place in 2011 and 2013. And it was really in 2014, 2015 that RBG became a big cultural figure among the young. But we understood that she was becoming a big deal, first of all, because she was like little and old and cute, and people thought it was great that she was like successful and very tough, what with her littleness, and writing these tough dissents against some of the more conservative Supreme Court opinions. But we understood that the young women who were starting to make a big thing of her and call her the notorious RBG and create all these little hilarious memes of her on the internet probably didn't understand the huge pivotal role she had played in American legal history, particularly in the 1970s, bringing a series of 6 cases before the Supreme Court, which she argued as a lawyer, basically trying to make the point that women should have equal rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the same clause that was used so brilliantly by Thurgood Marshall and others to assure or to press for anyway, to assure legally that there are equal rights between the races. So RBG had argued these very important cases, and yet they're not widely known in the way that women's stories end up being not widely known for a whole variety of reasons.
Right.
I did the first year of law school. The RBG's cases, you get a big fat case book in your constitutional law class of all the major cases. Cases RBG brought to the court are not in there. I remember on the night of our premiere in Washington, the great Congressman Ted Lieu of California came up to me after the Q&A and said, how did I not know this? And I said to him, I know, like, that's why we made the movie.
It's the canon. The canon does not have a lot of women.
Yeah, the canon has not been great in its inclusion of women and certainly of people of color. So that's why we made the film. And it was a wonderful experience all around.
And Pauli Murray, what was fascinating about Pauli Murray?
These projects often stem from one another. In the case of Pauli Murray, it stemmed directly from RBG, who had, on the very first brief that RBG wrote in a Supreme Court case in 1971, she put Pauli Murray's name on the cover of the brief as a co-author, even though, and we noticed that when we were editing the film, like, and just doing the graphics, like, what's that? Actually, the name was kind of familiar, like we had maybe heard of Pauli. Anyway, that led us to look into Pauli and ultimately to ask Justice Ginsburg, basically, Pauli was to say, like, oh, did this other lawyer work on this case? Which the answer was no. Pauli Murray didn't work on the cases that RBG brought before the Supreme Court, but it was actually Pauli's idea, this whole thing about the 14th Amendment should apply to women's rights as well as the rights of African Americans. It was just like a huge legal insight from a brilliant legal mind, something Pauli had written about in basically a thesis paper at Howard Law School in the 1940s. That was like more than a decade before Brown v. Board of Education. She had written about the 14th Amendment vis-a-vis race at Howard way before Brown was argued. Then she had written a law journal article later making the case about women's rights in the 14th Amendment. That was 15 years before RBG. So Pauli was just an ahead of their time kind of person. Even though this wasn't a household name, it just made us think, like, why not? Should we make a film that both talks about Pauli's legacy, all the amazing things that this person did? And you notice I'm being a little vague pronoun wise because Pauli didn't clearly identified at some points in life as a man. Not clear, was Pauli trans, non-binary, but Pauli was an Episcopal priest, a published writer and poet and activist and, civil rights activist, women's rights activist, just like this huge scope of a person with an incredible life and who had such huge influences on some of our major figures, including RBG and Thurgood Marshall. So we thought maybe we should make a film that's both about Pauli's story and about the movement, and it is a movement, to sort of recover and amplify who Pauli Murray was. We didn't start that movement. That movement had been going on for a long time, particularly in academia, particularly among Black women professors who'd been teaching Pauli Murray for decades, but had been really increasing that. So our film kind of both documents this growing movement to elevate Pauli and then becomes part of it.
Which sort of leads, let's jump over Julia Child for a second and leads then into your most recent work, Everybody. And that is, again, It's not creating a movement. You are sort of sliding into a movement and telling a story that is certainly inspirational, but does highlight for people who are not as, who don't quite fathom LGBTQIA and what does that all mean. You have done a tremendous job of bringing what this means to a level that can be understood.
Certainly, I guess it increased my interest. Everybody sort of emerged in a somewhat different way. But so everybody is a story about the intersex rights movement. These are people who are not necessarily trans. They're people who medically and biologically don't fit neatly into the male female boxes. There are people who have been described kind of misleadingly as hermaphrodites. That's really that's a word from the animal kingdom where people might have, where a organism might actually have fully formed both male and female reproductive organs and be able to reproduce by themselves. There are no people like that. But what there are is people who, by their chromosomes or by their anatomy, don't fit neatly into the male or female. They might have XY male chromosomes, but appear on the exterior in all parts of their body to be female. They might have, something that's like, I don't know what kind of show we're on, so I always want to be a little careful talking graphically, anatomically, but they might be born, as someone in our film was, with genitals that it's really not clear, is this a penis or is it a clitoris? They might have what appears to be external male genitalia, but they have a womb and ovaries. Like they might have female genitalia, but they don't have a womb and ovaries. This is sort of, because we don't like talking about bodies, there's been extremely unfortunate history of making people whose bodies are born this way feel totally ashamed, often performing unnecessary surgeries on them to force them towards one gender or other, often forcing them to be girls when it's not clear that that's who they are. And there's been a thought of like, oh, this is incredibly rare. These people are freaks, but actually it's not that rare. And they're not freaks. They're just people, as I think our film makes quite clear by sort of focusing on three people who are leading advocates and activists in the intersex rights movement, and who are all just like really spectacular people who I loved getting to know as a filmmaker and thought that the audience would enjoy getting to know as well, and understanding how our obsession with putting people in gender boxes has caused huge, it causes harm in so many ways, but one of the ways that it caused harm to many people who are intersex is that there are unnecessary surgeries performed on them when they're kids, and often either they're told to keep their medical conditions absolutely secret, never tell anyone, including your romantic partners, because then no one will love you and want to marry you and whatever, or they're not told themselves. In those cases, and there are many, people have a sense because they're hearing, like they're going to the doctor and the doctor's saying a lot of weird things. A lot of times the kids are literally told they have cancer when they don't, just to explain why they're having all these surgeries. It's a horrifying story, but the way that the current day activists who've decided, kind of taking a page from the LGBT movement, have kind of decided like, no, wait a second, we have nothing to be ashamed of. Shameful is the way we were treated, not who we are. We're going to form a community. We're going to be proud of who we are and show who we are. And there's this just beautiful blossoming movement of people doing that. And again, it's a film that kind of, I would say, documents that movement, but is also becomes part of the movement.
All right. So you have now just really graphically done the best pitch possible for anybody who has streaming to be able to go to Hulu and Apple Plus and Amazon or Peacock and see Everybody or Pauli Murray.
Yes, Pauli Murray's on Prime Video. Yes, and RBG, I think you can watch now on Hulu.
So what does this mean for the film itself, that it kind of makes its way through the film festivals and then lands on streaming?
Well, but you're skipping the part where they're in movie theaters, which has been true for all the films that we talked about. A little less so for Pauli Murray, which came out during COVID, so it was in a few theaters for a couple weeks, but mostly was on Amazon. But the other two had real theatrical runs. RBG was put out by Magnolia Pictures, and Everybody was put out by Focus, and was in a lot of AMC theaters in the summer of 23. All that said, truthfully, being on streaming is where most people see these films. Even a film that was quite popular in theaters like RBG didn't even come close to having as many people see it in theaters as who ultimately see it on its many CNN airings and also in its streaming. Like, that's where a film can really get an audience. So as much as filmmakers have I think just a natural intuitive preference from theaters, because there is something there, the way a movie in some ways is meant to be seen is a big gathering of people all watching it together on a big screen. I mean, Everybody happened to premiere at Tribeca in New York, where there is a large intersex community. I don't know how they all became aware of the film, but they did. And we had this incredible experience at the premiere of like a whole group of intersex people who I hadn't met, just when photos were being taken on the red carpet, just kind of rushing the red carpet and wanting to be in the red carpet pictures. And we were like, that's amazing, come join us, which they did. And being in a room of people watching a film that was sort of telling their life story in a way that happily they found to be very affirming was probably my most emotional filmmaker day ever, I would say.
And what a group of people to overrun the sanctuary of the red carpet. The red carpet rules no longer exist, it seems,
Right.
because they've been broken and nobody got arrested.
Right, exactly.
And nobody got hurt, which is the other aspect.
Yes.
That's amazing, and I think poignant that you have now produced a film that you intellectually and the legal basis and the horror stories, all of that dark place, you then are able to turn it around into something positive that is so appreciated by the very community that that they just shine on you.
Yeah. When we started in the project, we had a consulting producer, Shauna Knizhnik, who is intersex, and her main guidance was just like, we're sick of trauma porn. We want, please include intersex joy in the story. And we took that very seriously and really went out of our way to make as joyful a film as one could make about medical trauma. But it was possible because the current movement, like, there's a lot, like, seeing people kind of come into their own and into their power is an inspiring thing. And that's how it felt to watch them and present it.
What is, for the most part, the greatest obstacle you face when you are considering, not when the project is actually firmed up, but when you're considering starting a project like you, Julie Cohen?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, it's actually a fairly hard time in the documentary business to get to launch projects and get funding for them. So the real obstacle is this a film that seems like they would have an avenue for somebody to want to fund and or distribute it. Sometimes that's the same entity, sometimes it's not. So, like, is this something that's really going to be feasible to do and to get out into the world?
Mhm. You've focused on communities that are misunderstood and have this positive light. I mean, I hate asking the question, "Oh, is that kind of a woman thing?" Do you think that in covering some of this material, you just are approaching it differently because you are a woman and you and your collaborators, Betsy West included, are women, that brings a different gaze to the subject matter?
It's hard to say because because I don't know what it would be like to make the films I'm making as a man. I mean, I will say that I've seen some really incredible feminist films by men. So, but like, one that comes to mind is Maiden, about the women that sailed around the world.
Yes, I love
A
that.
British guy directed, which I love. I think that here's the main thing that I think comes in from women filmmakers with the subject matter that we take on. one of the main tenets of feminism, that the personal is political and the political is personal. I don't know how that became a big feminist thing. I actually think it grows from something that women just intuitively understand, because I think it's true. Our womanness helps make that. I think personal stuff finds its way into these what could be political issue stories that we're telling. First of all, focusing on an individual, often an individual human being or a small group of people is one thing, but just also making someone's real life part of the story. A number of people, including some of the male critics that saw RBG, seemed very taken aback that we focused so much on her marriage. And often we're sort of saying like, but it's supposed to be a feminist thing, so why is like a man playing such a big story in it? But like, we just understood, well, first of all, we love that part of the story and love stories and whatever. But also, like, I just really strongly subscribe to the idea that the personal is political. And I'm always trying to make political films very personal and like personal films political. And because I really do think it's mushed together. And I do think that comes from me being a woman and a feminist.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, the personal is political, political, personal. There is the other P word, and that is power. And so it's not just a matter of the power one is able to wield, but also the intrinsic, where is the source of power? And for a woman trying to navigate in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, and 80s, and today, to bring forth brilliance and intellect and commit the time, a very healthy relationship with a partner and or a man is, that is sometimes the difference. That is, that is somebody who is bringing an ease to the lifelong emotional daily chores that otherwise had been assigned to those women.
Yeah. When young people, filmmakers or journalists or whatever, when young women, and it mostly is women actually, that are coming to me asking for career advice, whatever, that's like, this fits in with my personal political thing. That's actually my first, I'm like, this is the most important advice I'm going to give you. Like, choose your partner really carefully. And that is career advice. That's not my life advice. That's my career advice. If I didn't have my husband supporting my career sort of in every way, but like mostly psychologically and spiritually, like, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing. That's true, obviously, whatever the gender of one's partner is. The reason I wouldn't make a big deal of saying this to a young straight man is like, yeah, your woman's going to be supportive of your career because that's what ladies have done forever. But it's different, it's different with guys. And it is interesting that these hugely successful women that we've protest, like RBG and Julia Child, and actually one we didn't mention, Gabby Giffords, have all had crazy supportive, super loving, like, I'm going to go to the ends of the earth, and in Gabby's case, or all the way into space for you, kind of guys that are, because it's not easy being a professional woman, and especially if you're going to add motherhood into that. And you kind of need, in RBG's case, she had a husband who was willing to do half the housework and half the childcare, and then as she got promoted more and more, did a little more of the housework and the childcare.
Anybody who's doing a modern documentary, you sort of now are setting the standard that if the spouse is as supportive and integral a part of the story, first of all, that spouse owns that story too and deserves the credit.
Yes.
That is correcting a wrong that has existed clear up until the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. That we could just dismiss Eleanor Roosevelt because FDR was the president.
Right.
We can dismiss the wives. So, and it's a great segue then into Julia, because Julia Child's husband was,
yes,
part and parcel. I mean, he was so much a part of her success.
Right.
So I just have to ask then, do you like to cook? How did you get involved with Julia Child and her
So Julia is the only one. All of the other ones came from this deep place of thinking it through and deciding to pursue it. Julia Child is actually a project that came to us. Somebody had intellectual property and connected us to the Julia Child Foundation and whatever. We actually get lots and lots of inquiries like that. That's the only time we've ever taken it. I love to cook. My original career goal was to be a chef. When I was
Oh,
in junior high and high school, I had my own catering business. I went to a summer cooking program after my junior year of high school, in which I actually met a number of women who were already professionals in the food industry, sous chefs mostly. I loved the program, but the women talked me. They were like, "It's terrible." Like they really successfully talked me out of it. They were like, "You don't want to go into this career. It's horrible." This was in, I'm in high school now, so this is in the 80s. But you don't want to do this. It's miserable. It's miserable for women. You're working 24-hour a day. You'll have no personal life. People treat you like crap. Nobody used the term sexual harassment back then, but they basically, people are pinching you all the time. Like it's a nightmare. And I really love these women. It was great being friends with them. I loved the program. I was like, okay, I like as they sort of talked me out of it. So I'm like, I guess I'll do something else.
yeah. So I'll go into journalism, which has none of that.
Like, I guess I thought like I could, I mean, cooking is a skill that I can keep and use without having it be my profession. And I'm really glad I made that choice because I think I probably wouldn't. I mean, I talk about my husband being super modern and supportive, but like I do cook dinner. Like my one big thing, he's very good on all the housework. I cook dinner every night. And it's like my respite away from everything. It feels like a little bit of peace to step back and make and enjoy a meal. So yeah, I really love cooking. I grew up in the prime Julia period. So I really appreciated her also as a character. Like she was so notable. As the film, like everybody watched Julia Child like in the 70s, and I did too. And she was amazing.
So in the concept of TV herstory and the great job that your documentary does of really bringing forward the story of those earliest days where Julia is discovered as this incredibly intellectual. I mean, she understands the chemistry aspect and she's willing to put the work behind it. And she just sort of stumbled into this opportunity at WGBH in Boston. You had Ina Garten, and so you did a brief interview with her. Were there are people really willing to kind of fangirl or gush about Julia Child?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't surprised about Garden, but we were more surprised about Marcus Samuelson, kind of a younger, hipper chef. No offense, Ina. What we were surprised both when we were making the film and I mean, Jose Andres, I think we already somehow knew we were surprised that he basically said he learned English by watching Julia Child like videos. So that's pretty big. We were surprised, especially also during the promoting of films, how current modern day chefs really are into her. Like everybody has Mastering the Art of French Cooking like on their shelf and has gone through the whole thing. Like it's no, she's really widely admired. And I think what drew us to that project was that, yes, everybody knows who she is, but people know her mostly through the Dan Aykroyd SNL impression where she's kind of a joke. And like sort of, the thing with women's history, if it's not ignored altogether, sometimes it's trivialized.
And you sort of picked up a little bit on the film from a few years earlier, Julia and Julie, or Julie and Julia, which sort of brought some education to what Julia Child's life was and
Yes.
everything. And it was wildly entertaining, and I think women appreciated. I would like to think that the success of that gave you some sense that wow, there is still demand.
Yes, I mean certainly that's a lot of people's frame of reference for Julia Child. Like interesting to note that as a generational thing because to me the reference for Julia Child is Julia Child herself and Saturday Night Live. I saw that movie. I actually loved it. I'm a Meryl Streep fan.
And you didn't back down in the documentary, and so this is again the sort of the value add is that you also brought then her in her later years when she had nothing to lose and she recognized her power, that she stepped into some of her own political beliefs and she didn't back down from them. And so the reproductive rights and the HIV AIDS, and really encouraging doing what you did not have the opportunity to receive, and that is encouraging women to get in, because if there aren't women, it's never going to improve for the future generations. There are so many different stories or lessons that you bring forth by using Julia's own words or her own video, or her writings, or the memories of others, and that makes it very effective, I think.
Thank you. It was a very fun project to do.
She sat for so many, she just was so prolific both in video and audio. Were there any particularly relevant major interviews she did that sort of that had so much value that they became a more important part of the documentary?
Yeah, I mean, you're always basing it on what you have. Of course, Julia had died long before we made our project, so we were a little bit constrained by what existed. We were happy to find that there were a lot of interviews of her in different phases, including a big one that had been done by the Television Academy, the people that run the Emmys, which is a fairly major part of the film, and which was, those kind of things are sort of for their archives. That's not something that had been that had been out in the world, but like we came across it at a certain point, and so used a fair amount of that and a lot of radio interviews, thanks to the great skill of Carla Gutierrez, who edited that film. You often can't tell that you're hearing little snippets of like 6 different interviews like mushed together in a single section, but believe me, you are. We're just using what we have to tell the story. And I should take that opportunity to say Carla just made her feature debut with the film Frida, about Frida Kahlo, of which myself and Betsy are executive producers. So that's another one that's really, really, really worth seeing.
So Julia Child sort of created the modern day cooking show kind of on the fly with the help of a very supportive crew at WGBH, which included her husband, coming in to kind of help and be that extra props person. How were you able to capture those stories? Are there still people alive?
Trying to preserve these stories from history involves us often interviewing people who were very glad that we're able to get their stories on camera. And actually, several of the people that we interviewed for that film, which was a great privilege to interview, including Russ Morash, who was her main producer at GBH, have subsequently passed away. He gave us a great, really lively interview in the film, and we use it a lot in the film. Also, some of her neighbors in Cambridge who we interviewed, who were elderly, who have subsequently passed away. So it's like, it feels like it's not like we're bad luck. It's just like when you're interviewing a lot of people in their 90s, like they're not always going to live forever. And you realize like the huge value in giving them a chance to really tell their stories in a big way.
Let's kind of close out a little bit. I'm just going to ask you, so growing up, what was a TV show that you saw that you saw yourself in?
Yeah, well, that is a very easy that's a really easy question for someone of my generation. I just turned 61. Mary Tyler Moore is the foundational like idol and role model, I would think, for many women of my generation. Just like and the fact that she was a TV news producer, and seeing what like everything about her, the way she carried herself, she was self-deprecating, but she also had a lot of pride. She was unabashedly ambitious,
Yeah.
and her main priority was not getting married, even though she was interested in having an active sex life. Like there was a lot like that show, which I think started in 1970. So I was 4 years old at the time. That show was really eye-opening because she was actually presenting quite a different model for what it meant to be a woman than most of what was I grew up in Virginia, so I was getting something very different from her than I was getting from most of society, and it struck me very, very hard. She was beautiful, but that was not the point. That was not the point about her. That was not the whole. Like occasionally she would get like leered at a little bit, but like to the extent that there was sort of sexism towards her, the show was explicit about that and being a problem. Like Lou Grant started out being a little patronizing to her, but he was a great guy and he really respected her.
Yes.
He wasn't trying to demean her. He wasn't trying to like touch her inappropriately. He was a hell of a lot more respectful than most of the guys that I dealt with when I was her age, going into the TV, news world, but however many years, 15 years later, to be totally honest.
So that girl and Mary Tyler Moore, they sort of were these, almost prehistoric now when you think about it, but their impact cannot be studied enough. And I thought that the documentary of Mary's life.
Yes, I love the Mary Tyler Moore doc.
Yeah, I watched that on a plane and it was just like the best flight ever.
Yes, really good.
Kudos to those people.
Yeah, that was a dude, by the way.
Well, but did a really good job.
Yeah.
So that is great. I guess the last question, are there any projects that you can talk about? I realize you juggle a lot and have to keep some of them close. Any that you can talk about that are on the horizon that you're feeling good about?
Yeah, unfortunately, in terms of specifics, I'm going to have to say no. There are projects, but they're in the phase of fundraising, trying to make them happen, I can say that there are some amazing, hugely relevant to today's situation and feminist projects that I'm working on.
Oh, that's all I need to hear. That you're busy and it sounds like you're loving every minute of it and your connections only grow. We wish you the very best. We will undoubtedly have you back on if any of your subject matter has that intersection with TV and herstory and all the things. But your start in TV obviously gave you all the skills it takes to build the canon, as we say, and make sure that there are generations ahead who will understand that progress is actually, in fact, kind of slow, and it takes the courage to be in the fray, which is where we find ourselves.
Absolutely.
All right, you can follow Julie Cohen on Instagram and Blue Sky Social at filmmaker Julie. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I love it when guests as energetic and prolific as Julie Cohen deliver us lessons that have some things to do with TV and an awful lot to do about society and who we are and how we can contribute. And for that, well, that's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Many thanks as well to Mary Lou Morose for editing this episode and Nivea Lopez for doing the video editing that gets this visual interview to YouTube. Find this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Pandora, and most podcast apps. And when you have a chance, go to tvherstory.com. You'll be able to see the entire archive as well as a lot of other good stuff about the podcast. Sign up for our newsletter while you're there. I promise your information will never be sold. Lastly, the music you hear is Jazzer's Take Me Higher, found at Free Music Archive. Be well, be strong, be kind. Thanks for listening.